In these next few minutes, I will give you a rundown of almost everything that has occurred in the Bay of Pigs invasion. The spark that ignited the Bay of Pigs came in 1959 when Fidel Castro overthrew dictator Fulgencio Batista in order to seize power. The U.S. were extremely alarmed because of this, since Castro was a socialist who was said to have sympathies for the Soviet Union and its leader, Nikita Khrushchev. Although all the plans regarding the Bay of Pigs were primarily conceived by the CIA and President Dwight D. Eisenhower, it was carried out by John F. Kennedy, since Eisenhower was not able to complete his term before the completion of the Bay of Pigs. However, Eisenhower was who trained the several Cuban immigrants in a full-scale invasion of the Cuban homeland. The original plan for the Bay of Pigs involved a U.S. invasion of Cuba, with Cuban military and people supplying aid to the country's exiles in overthrowing Castro. The attack was a complete disaster. The World War II B-26 bombers of the U.S. completely missed the target, leaving Cuban airfield as clean as a whistle. The Cubans then sunk 2 American ships and attacked the Cuban exilers with low-flying aircraft-mounted automatic weapons, also known as strafing. The Cuban exiles that survived were captured by Castro or killed and sent to prison. About 2 years later, the United States were finally able to negotiate a $53 million deal in order to restore the remaining exiles. In conclusion, the Bay of Pigs was detrimental to the Soviet Union war effort, but extremely inefficient for the United States because it sparked the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the Soviets decided to implant nuclear missiles in Cuba, the U.S. were forced to negotiate terms with the USSR rather than invade the Cuban region again. In contemporary times, the Bay of Pigs is regarded by many historians and an average American as one of the biggest catastrophes of the Cold War and of late 1900 military tacticians. It gave the Soviets a morale boost and caused many Cuban exiles to be massacred by Castro.
1959, Fidel Castro took control of Cuba by force and remained its dictatorial leader for nearly 5 decades. As the leader of the only communist country in the Western Hemisphere, Castro has been the focus of international controversy. Fidel Castro was born near his father's farm, Biran, in southwest Cuba, in what was then the Oriente province. Castro's father, Angel Castro, was an immigrant from Spain who had prospered in Cuba as a sugarcane farmer. Although Castro's father, Angel, was married to Maria Luiso Argota, he had 5 children out of wedlock with Lina Ruz Gonzalez, who worked for him as a maid and cook. Years later, Angel and Lina did marry. Fidel Castro spent his youngest years on his father's farm, but spent most of his youth in Catholic boarding schools, excelling in sports.
34th President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, born in 1890 and died in 1969. Full name was Dwight David Eisenhower, nicknamed Ike. Took part in the U.S. Military Academy and graduated from West Point, New York in 1915. Born in Texas and raised in Kansas, Dwight D. Eisenhower was one of America's greatest military commanders and the 34th President of the United States.
You know it.
Inspired by the example of a friend who was going to the U.S. Naval Academy, Eisenhower, who won and appointed to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Although his mother had religious convictions that made her a pacifist, she did not try to stop Eisenhower from being a military officer. He was the president at the time during the Bay of Pigs invasion.
And I'll prove this message.